This video is going to be my review of the Transition Smuggler from a first impression standpoint. So when I get a bike like this, I'll do several reviews. I'll do a first look, which I did already, and I'll link that below. First impressions, and then I'll do a longer term review. I'll do some comparisons also, and I'll talk about that at the end of this video. So what I did was I went up to the mountains last weekend and I rode DuPont in Pisgah in North Carolina. Probably my favorite area of the country to ride. Pisgah is just next level. I mean, climbs that take almost an hour and then descents that are 20 minutes. Phenomenal. Now, I will say, this is not a bike that you would buy for cross-country riding or if you live in a flatter, more tame terrain. I live in North Central Florida, and I'll just go ahead and say it right now. I don't ride this bike in Florida much, and I don't think you should buy a bike like this if you mainly ride cross-country trails. This is my go to the mountains and ride bike, which I try to do a lot throughout the year. Either North Georgia, North Carolina, West Virginia. And so I use this bike for those trips. Now, it does okay on cross-country trails, but you're better off with something like the Transition Spur. So I just want to get that out of the way. All right, now let's talk about the bike. I'm going to knock off a few component highlights here, and I'll start with the cockpit. So the cockpit is totally dialed. The stem length is perfect. It's a 40, I think. It's got 800 millimeter wide bars. You can trim them down if you want. I don't. The SDG saddle is super comfortable. 4 straight days of riding, and I had no problems with the saddle. The one-up dropper post works flawlessly. Let me talk about the SRAM T-Type drivetrain. That's kind of the highlight of this bike for me in terms of components. I've never ridden SRAM T-Type before, and I've ridden Axis before, but not with this pod, this SRAM pod, which I really like. I was kind of neutral on Axis. Now, really like Axis. You can shift under about as hard of a load as you want to put on the drivetrain. I'm so used to lightly pedaling as you shift from years and years of riding mechanical shifting, a non-T-Type. I mean, you can absolutely just stomp on the pedals when you shift. Now, there is a delay if you try to do multiple shifts, especially downshifting, so maybe you hit it 2 or 3 times, it will delay, so it makes sure that it goes down into the next gear before it shifts again, which is actually kind of cool because you can jam up your drivetrain if you don't do that, if you just try to shift too many gears at one time. This direct mount rear derailleur is pretty much bomb-proof. I rode with a couple guys who had flown in from Utah for the weekend. They didn't really know the trail system, so I said, listen, I'm doing this ride, just follow me if you want. And they did, and they were really glad because the trails that we rode were some of the best in Pisgah. And on one of the just flatter trails after Avery Creek, he got a stick in his rear derailleur and broke his rear derailleur. I mean, like that, like it was nothing. And I've done that before several times. But this rear derailleur direct mount is so bomb-proof. Now, I'm not saying it's completely indestructible, but a stick in the derailleur is probably not going to break the derailleur hanger on this bike. It's that good. And so that kind of was an eye-opener for me, you know, because think about it. You fly in somewhere on a trip, you drive a long way, and you're out in the middle of nowhere, and you break your rear derailleur. Now, I usually carry an extra rear derailleur hanger, but who knows, you can just wad your derailleur up into the spokes. So anyway, just a little side note there of the benefit of this, but I really like the SRAM T-Type. Now let me talk about the riding qualities, because obviously you can get the Smuggler in different build kits. You don't have to go with Axis. It's pretty expensive. There's no doubt about it. There's no getting around it. This is an expensive bike, but it's good. It's really good. So let me first talk about one downside, and that is the seat post is slipping on this bike, just like it did on my Spur. Now, I figured out how to remedy it. I called Transition, and I'll link in the description below a video on how I remedied that. I've not done that yet because I just got back a few days ago from my trip, and so I'll have to do that same thing. Hopefully that'll solve it, but I don't know what it is with these one-up dropper posts and Transition frames, but I've had 2 of them now with the seat post is slipping, so I'll just get that out of the way. That's pretty much the only negative. So this bike has a pretty good pedaling platform. It is a horse link design. It is not a flexible seat stay, no pivot in the back type bike like the Spur. The Smuggler has a horse link, and it has a pretty decent pedaling platform. I didn't really notice too much suspension bob. However, it was really important to put the rear shock in the firm position when climbing on this bike. If you didn't, you did get some pedal bob, and I noticed that I had more pedal strikes. In fact, the first climb that I did was pretty techy. It was in DuPont up Big Rock, if you know that climb, and I had some pedal strikes. I actually did that climb again at the end of the ride with the rear shock in the firm position, and it was much better in terms of pedal strikes. Now, you do get pedal strikes on this bike. It has a low bottom bracket, which is why it descends so amazingly well. The Spur is the same way. Great handling bike, but when you have a low bottom bracket, you're gonna get pedal strikes. More so than like my 9er Rip 9. You gotta be really careful. You really have to ratchet the pedals so you don't have a downstroke right on top of that root ledge or rock ledge that's, you know, even like, you know, 3 inches high. You gotta be careful. And pedal strikes suck. I mean, they can kill your climb. A lot of bikes today that are lower, longer, slacker, that lower bottom bracket is going to cause more pedal strikes. But like I mentioned a minute ago, the descending on this bike is awesome, and it's because of the geometry. I can feel the weight of this bike compared to my Spur. There's no doubt about it. This is a heavier bike. It's maybe, I don't know, 3-4 pounds heavier than the Spur. You can definitely notice it. That being said, it's one of those bikes that'll just get up the climbs with no fuss. You're not going to set any KOMs, but it does. It's a decent climber. It doesn't climb like the Spur. I mean, that's obvious, but it's a pretty good climber. You just got to be wary of the pedal strikes. Now let's talk about descending. This bike has a little bit longer wheelbase than some other bikes that I've ridden, like my 9er Rip 9. And by the way, I'm going to do a video coming up where I do a direct comparison with this and the 9er Rip 9. Similar bikes, a little bit different geometry, different riding qualities. That video will be coming up in a few weeks. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned to the channel. That's going to be a pretty cool video. I literally did a big loop, and then the next day went out on the 9er and did the same loop. So I got some really good comparisons between these two. So the longer wheelbase makes this bike a very, very stable descender. When you're going through, you know, rough stuff, the bike is just so, I hate to use a jargon word like composed, but composed is a really great way to describe it because it's just not unsettled very easily when you're descending over rough stuff because of that longer wheelbase. It is more agile than my Transition Sentinel that I had and I rode for, I mean, I had 2 Sentinels, V1, V2, and this bike is more agile, which is nice because the Sentinel was a downhill brawler. It just was not the most agile bike. It had a pretty slack head angle, 63.5. This bike, I think, is a 65, which is, to me, kind of the sweet spot. Speaking of the head angle and climbing, this bike did not wander around a whole lot. So when you get to those really steep pitches, I've had some bikes where, like the Sentinel, where the head angle is so slack that the front end just wanders around. Not like that on this bike. This bike was really, really well composed on the climbs as well, as far as the front end wandering around. Now, don't get me wrong, like, it's not a cross-country bike, so the front end will wander around more than like the Spur, but it was not bad on the climb. So just want to mention that for the head angle. Now, I will say that there were some trails in Pisgah where I would have rather have been on the Sentinel on the descents. For example, Black Mountain, especially middle and lower Black, where it gets a little chunky, Avery Creek, trails where you can still go really fast, but it does get a little chunky for the speed that you're carrying. And it would have been nice to have more travel, but you didn't necessarily need it unless you were just going absolutely enduro race pace. That's where a longer travel bike will really help. The front end on the descents, it feels pretty light. It feels, you know, like I said, it's more agile than the Sentinel. It has a nice feel where you can just move the bike around, pick a line a little bit easier than a longer travel bike. And so I really like the way the front end felt on this bike. Still felt stable. It just hits the sweet spot for so many things. So I would say for the amount of travel that this bike has, like when you look on paper and you look at 140, 130, it's not a ton of travel for descending, but you have a lot more confidence on the descents. It's just like my Spur. Like you look at the Spur, you look at the 120 front and rear for the Spur on paper and you're like, man, no way would I fly down a techie descent. That bike's awesome on the descents for the amount of travel it has, and this bike is the same way. On the last ride, is when I really started to get the feel of this bike. And what I mean by that is you don't just grip the bike hard and just power through stuff on this bike like you would a long travel bike, like the Sentinel. If you relax and you let the bike move around, that's where this bike absolutely shines on the descents, which is another reason why I always recommend people to be slightly underbiked than overbiked, especially if you're newer to riding. Because if you get too much travel, you can just rely too much on the bike, on the descents, and just power over stuff and just expect the bike to soak it all up and get lazy on your riding technique. This bike causes you to be a little bit more attentive with your riding technique, but man, when you relax, you let the bike do its thing, this bike is amazing on the descents. So that's gonna wrap it up for this first impression video. Like I mentioned, I'm gonna do a video coming up where I compare this to the Rip 9. Even if you don't plan on buying like a Rip 9 or a Smuggler, I think you'd be interested in watching that video because it really talks about how different companies have a little bit different view on geometry and how that view changes the way the bikes ride. They're both excellent, but they do ride a little bit differently, especially on the descents, and I'll talk about that in that video. Another video that I'll be doing shortly is I'm going to take this bike out on my local cross-country trails and compare it to the Spur, and I may even do a time trial. Now the reason I'm doing that, like I said, it's not because you would want to buy this bike for cross-country, but if you did have this bike for just all around, how is it on cross-country trails? Are you just going to be left behind by your riding buddies, or can you keep up? And is this bike okay for cross country so that you have a bike that you can also take up into the mountains? So I think a lot of you will get something out of that video because all of us are looking for that one bike, you know, just to have less clutter in the garage and spend less money. So I'll try to do my best to help you decide if a bike like this is okay for cross country type riding, as long as you're not, you know, racing or doing super fast group rides. How about you? Have you ridden one of these? Do you own one of these? Let us know in the comments below what your impressions are, and if you have any other questions or comments, drop those below as well. Thanks for watching.